Keanu Reeves stared at the letter in his hands, the rough paper crinkling slightly under his fingers. The ink, dark and uneven, looked as though it had been hastily written with an old quill. The message was brief but chilling. "Mr. Reeves, you must come. There is something only you can understand. Time is running out. Travel to the village of Vârcolac in the Carpathian Mountains. You will find answers you have long sought." There was no sender's name, no return address. Just those few enigmatic lines, urging him toward a place he had never heard of. Keanu had spent years ignoring strange letters and obsessive fans, but this one was different. It was neither a request for an autograph nor a conspiracy theory-filled rant. Something about it gnawed at him, whispering that it was more than a hoax. And that last sentence, "answers you have long sought," unsettled him the most. What answers? Despite his reservations, Keanu found himself boarding a private flight to Romania 2 days later, his unease mounting with each passing mile. A long drive through winding roads led him into the heart of the Carpathian Mountains. The deeper he traveled, the denser the mist became, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. By the time he arrived in Vârcolac, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows over the village. It was smaller than he had expected. No more than a collection of old stone houses, a crumbling church, and a single tavern. The people, clad in heavy woolen coats and scarves, moved in silence, their gazes flickering toward him before quickly looking away. Keanu stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. A cold wind whistled through the streets, but it wasn't the weather that made him shiver. It was the way the villagers watched him. Not with the curiosity of someone recognizing a Hollywood star, but with a mixture of awe and fear. An old woman clutching a bundle of dried herbs muttered something in Romanian as she hurried past him, her eyes never meeting his. A group of men, huddled near the tavern's entrance, whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing his way. He approached them cautiously. "Excuse me," he said, his voice even. "I'm looking for someone. I received a letter asking me to come here." The tallest of the men, a broad-shouldered figure with deep lines etched into his weathered face, frowned. "No one should have called you here," he said in heavily accented English. "Yet here I am," Keanu replied. "Who sent this?" He pulled the letter from his coat pocket and held it up. The man's eyes darkened as he read it. The others behind him exchanged uneasy glances. "Who wrote this?" Keanu pressed. "No one sane," the man muttered. "You should leave before it is too late." Keanu folded his arms. "I came a long way. I'm not leaving until I know what this is about." The man exhaled sharply, then gestured toward the tavern. "If you must stay, speak to Illy. He knows more than any of us." Inside, the tavern smelled of damp wood and strong liquor. A fire crackled in the hearth, offering the only real warmth in the dim-lit space. A few villagers sat at wooden tables, drinking in silence. At the bar, an older man with silver-streaked hair was wiping a glass with slow, deliberate movements. Keanu approached him. "Are you Illy?" The bartender's hand froze mid-wipe. He lifted his gaze, and Keanu saw the same apprehension reflected in his eyes. "I knew you would come," Illy murmured. Keanu stiffened. "Then you know who sent the letter?" Illy nodded, setting the glass down. "I do." He motioned for Keanu to sit. With a deep breath, Keanu slid onto a stool. "Tell me." Illy studied him for a long moment, then leaned in slightly. "This village has carried a secret for centuries," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A curse that we cannot escape." Keanu frowned. "A curse?" Illy nodded. "A darkness that should have been buried long ago." He hesitated, then added, "And you are the key to stopping it." Keanu's stomach twisted. He had expected a mystery, maybe even danger, but not this. Before he could respond, the tavern door burst open, a gust of icy wind swept inside, and a hunched figure stumbled in, his face pale with terror. "They found another one," the man gasped. "At the edge of the forest." A heavy silence fell over the room. Illy's face turned grim. He shot Keanu a meaningful look. "You should not have come," he said, but it was too late. Keanu had walked into something far darker than he had ever imagined. Keanu woke to the sound of crows cawing outside his window. The early morning light struggled to pierce through the thick mist that wrapped around the village like an unshakable presence. He sat up in the small wooden bed of the inn, his mind still replaying the unsettling words of Ilie from the night before. A curse, a darkness, and somehow he was part of it. Determined to find answers, he left the inn and began walking through the village. The streets were quiet, the villagers moving about their morning tasks with a nervous energy. No one met his gaze, and whispers followed wherever he walked. He noticed the strange markings first. Symbols carved into the stone walls of buildings, some crude and simple, others intricate and precise. They were old, their edges worn down by time. Keanu reached out, tracing one with his fingertips. It felt colder than the stone itself, as if the markings carried some unseen force. "Don't touch that." The voice was soft but urgent. Keanu turned to see a young woman standing behind him. She had deep brown eyes, framed by loose curls, and wore a heavy woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. There was something guarded about her posture, as if she wanted to help but was afraid to be seen doing so. "Are you Anya?" he asked, recalling Ilya's mention of someone who might understand more than the others. She hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "You shouldn't be here." "I keep hearing that." Keanu crossed his arms. "But I'm not leaving until I get some answers." Anya's eyes darted around the street before she stepped closer. "Then listen carefully," she whispered. "This village, it's not like other places. We don't speak of certain things, we don't ask questions, and we never—" She swallowed hard. "We never go near the forest." Keanu studied her expression, trying to gauge how much was fear and how much was something deeper. "But someone did," he said, recalling the terrified man from the tavern last night. "Someone disappeared." Anya's face paled. "It happens," she said simply. "That's not normal," Keanu pressed. "For us, it is." She turned to leave, but he caught her wrist, gently but firm enough to make her stop. "You sent the letter, didn't you?" Anya's breath hitched. "No," she said, but there was hesitation in her voice. Keanu released her, sensing he was pushing too hard. "Then tell me who did." Instead of answering, Anya took a step back. "Stay away from the mayor," she warned. "If he knows you're asking questions, he'll make sure you leave, one way or another." With that, she disappeared into the alleyway, leaving Keanu standing alone, with more questions than before. The town wrapped in fear. By noon, Keanu had wandered to the town square, where a small market was set up. Vendors sold dried meats, root vegetables, and strange herbal mixtures, but even in the bustle of daily life, something felt off. No one laughed, no children played. Conversations were hushed, words clipped short whenever he passed. Then he saw the mayor, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He wore a long black coat that made him look more like a judge than a leader. As soon as their gazes met, Keanu felt a chill creep up his spine. "You are the outsider," the mayor stated, his voice devoid of warmth. "Keanu," he corrected. The mayor studied him, his expression unreadable. "You should leave while you still can." Keanu didn't flinch. "People keep telling me that. For good reason." The mayor took a step closer, lowering his voice. "This is not a place for men like you. You do not belong here." Keanu narrowed his eyes. "Then why was I invited?" The mayor stiffened. "Whatever nonsense brought you here, forget it. I'll have a carriage ready by morning. Take it." "And if I don't?" The mayor's eyes darkened. "Then you will regret it." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Keanu with a heavy weight pressing against his chest. Something was very, very wrong in this village. The silence after sundown. That night, Keanu sat in his room, staring at the flickering candle on his bedside table. Outside, the village was eerily quiet. Too quiet. He glanced at the clock. 11:48 p.m. He didn't know why, but his gut told him something happened here at night. Something no one wanted to talk about. Moving carefully, he slipped on his coat and crept to the window. The street below was empty, not a single light in the houses. The whole village looked as though it had been abandoned. Then he saw it. A shadow, moving at the edge of the village, near the forest. It was hunched, moving in an unnatural, jerking way. Keanu leaned closer, squinting through the darkness. The figure stopped and turned its head toward him. Even from this distance, Keanu felt it, the weight of its gaze. Then, without a sound, it vanished into the trees. Keanu's pulse pounded in his ears. He was no longer just searching for answers. Now, he was part of whatever horror lurked in Vârcolac. The deeper Keanu ventured, the more unnatural the woods felt. The trees loomed high and gnarled, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal hands. The air smelled of damp earth, but there was something else beneath it, something metallic, like rust or dried blood. Then he saw the ruins, half buried in the earth. Ancient stone pillars jutted out at odd angles, covered in the same strange symbols he had seen in the village. Keanu moved closer, brushing away the moss from one of the carvings. The language was unfamiliar, but something about it stirred a deep, forgotten part of him. A whisper of wind curled through the trees, and with it, voices. Keanu tensed. Carefully, he stepped forward, crouching behind a crumbling stone wall. Peering over the edge, his breath caught in his throat. A group of people stood in a circle around a pit, an abyss so dark it seemed to swallow the light. Their faces were hidden beneath hooded cloaks, their hands raised in unison as they chanted in a language Keanu didn't recognize, a ritual. Keanu's pulse pounded in his ears. Then the air shifted, something moved in the pit, a long, spindly hand. Too thin, too elongated to be human, rose from the darkness. The fingers curled, the nails jagged and blackened. A second hand emerged, gripping the rocky edge, pulling something up from the depths. Keanu's stomach turned. The villagers weren't worshiping. They were summoning. The ground trembled. The cloaked figures stepped back as a guttural sound rumbled from the pit, like a deep primal growl that sent every nerve in Keanu's body screaming in warning. Then, as if sensing him, the figures turned their heads in unison. Keanu ducked. His heart pounded. He had to get out. But before he could move, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He whirled, fists ready, only to find himself face to face with Anya. Her eyes were wide with fear. "We have to go," she whispered. Keanu barely had time to react before the chanting stopped. A silence heavier than any he had ever known filled the air. Then a voice, ancient and inhuman, spoke from the pit. "He is here." The cloaked figures turned fully now, their faces still obscured by the hoods, but their movements were deliberate, their steps calculated. They knew he was watching. Anya grabbed his hand. "Run." Keanu didn't argue. They bolted through the trees, the sounds of hurried footsteps and whispering voices closing in behind them. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, moving faster than anything human should. Branches whipped at his face as they ran. The forest stretched endlessly before them, the village nowhere in sight. Then a head light. The tree line broke, and they stumbled onto the empty village road. Anya turned, breathless. The shadows stopped at the edge of the trees, retreating into the darkness. The village was still, silent. But Keanu knew what he had seen. Something had been awakened, and it was coming. Keanu sat in Illy's tavern, his hands wrapped around a cup of untouched black tea. Anya sat across from him, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds, as if expecting someone, or something, to burst in. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and the weight of what they had seen in the forest pressed down on them both. Illy finally spoke. "You should have never gone into the forest." Keanu exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It's too late for that." He set the cup down. "I need to know what's going on. No more cryptic warnings, no more half-truths." He turned to Anya. "You know something. Tell me." Anya hesitated, then gave Ilya a glance. The old man nodded, resigned, and gestured for her to continue. She took a deep breath. "This village is cursed." Keanu folded his arms. "Yeah, I got that much." No, she said, leaning in. I mean truly cursed. Centuries ago, something was sealed beneath this land, something ancient and unnatural. The villagers call it Umbra. Keanu frowned. Shadow? Anya nodded. A darkness that should have never existed. She clasped her hands together, her knuckles white. Long ago, our ancestors tried to destroy it, but they failed. The only thing they could do was trap it beneath the earth. In the pit, Keanu murmured, recalling the horrific sight of the ritual. Yes, Anya said. They bound it with blood magic, sacrificing their own to keep it imprisoned, but over time the bloodline of those who sealed it weakened. The rituals became desperate, incomplete, and now she swallowed. Now the seal is breaking, Keanu rubbed his face. And what does this have to do with me? Ely sighed. Everything. Keanu narrowed his eyes. Anya hesitated, then reached into the folds of her coat. She pulled out something wrapped in cloth and placed it on the table. Slowly, she unwrapped it. A rusted medallion lay in the center. Keanu stared at it. The symbol on it, the swirling, interwoven lines, felt eerily familiar. A strange sensation stirred in his chest, something old, buried deep within him. What is this? He asked. It belonged to the one who first sealed Umbra away, Anya said. To the only person strong enough to face it. She met his gaze. Your ancestor. Keanu felt his breath hitch. No, that's not possible, Anya held firm. You've always felt different, haven't you? As if something has been pulling you toward the unknown? That's because you are connected to it. The bloodline didn't disappear, it lived on. Keanu leaned back, his mind racing. It sounded insane, and yet it explained the eerie familiarity, the way the symbols in the ruins had stirred something deep in him. You are the last descendant, Elise said, the last piece of the seal. That's why you were summoned here. Keanu clenched his jaw. Summoned by who? Anya hesitated, then looked down. My father, she whispered. Keanu blinked. Your father? Anya nodded. He was one of the elders, one of the last keepers of the ritual. He knew the seal was failing, and when he realized that no one in the village could fix it, he looked for the only person who could. Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And now what? You expect me to fight this thing? Anya met his gaze. I expect you to help us stop it. Ely placed a hand on the table. You don't have to believe in destiny. You just have to believe in survival. If Umbra is freed, there won't be a village left. There won't be a world left. The words settled heavily over Keanu. He had come here looking for answers, and now he had found them, but they were more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. And there was no turning back. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Keanu stood at the edge of the village, staring toward the blackened sky above the forest. The ritual had failed. The seal had weakened beyond repair, and now Umbra was rising. A darkness so ancient and malevolent that the very air seemed to pulse with its hunger. He could still hear the villagers' screams from earlier. Those who had tried to flee had been swallowed by the shadows creeping through the trees. The others, those who had chosen to fight, were gathering now, armed with whatever weapons they could find. Hansia stood beside him, gripping a rusted dagger in one hand and a torch in the other. Ely, despite his age, held a hunting rifle, though the look in his eyes told Keanu that he didn't believe bullets would make a difference. A gust of wind howled through the village, carrying with it a voice. Keanu. It was not a whisper. It was a chorus of voices, layered over each other, reverberating inside his skull. He clenched his jaw. The connection was real. Whatever this thing was, it knew him, and it wanted him. Anya turned to him. We don't have much time. Keanu nodded. What do we do? Ilya exhaled. We make our stand here. The villagers formed a circle, torches casting flickering light across their tense faces. The shadows at the edge of the forest churned unnaturally, shifting as if alive. And then They came, figures, warped and elongated, crawling from the darkness with jerky, unnatural movements. Their eyes glowed like burning embers, and their mouths, if they had mouths, stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged, black teeth. The first one lunged. Keanu moved without thinking, raising the old medallion that Anya had given him. As soon as it left his pocket, the creature shrieked and recoiled, its form flickering as though struggling to remain solid. Anya's eyes widened. It hurts them. Keanu clenched the medallion in his fist. Whatever power his ancestors had used to seal Umbra away, it was in him too. He could feel it now, an ember deep in his chest, waiting to ignite. He took a step forward. The creatures hesitated. Another lunged. This time, Keanu didn't hesitate. The moment the creature got close, he swung his fist, the medallion colliding with its forehead. A deafening screech tore through the air as the creature's body convulsed and disintegrated into black mist. The other villagers took the cue and attacked. Torches swung, blades flashed, and for a brief moment, hope flared in Keanu's chest. They could win this, but then the ground cracked open. A column of pure darkness erupted from the pit in the forest, spiraling into the sky. The wind roared like a living beast, and from the depths of the earth, something massive began to emerge. Keanu's blood ran cold. It was here. Umbra, the villagers fell back, terror gripping them as a shape too vast and shifting to fully comprehend rose from the pit. Its form was amorphous. Shadows solidifying and unraveling, tendrils coiling and stretching across the sky. Where its face should have been, there was only a void that looked at him. Keanu, you cannot escape what you are. Pain seared through his skull. He dropped to one knee, gasping. The voice. It was inside him, inside every part of him. Memories not his own flashed through his mind. The first sealing, the blood sacrifices, the power that his ancestors had wielded. He understood now. He was the last in the bloodline, and the only way to stop Umbra was to finish what they had started. Anya was at his side, shaking him. Keanu, what do we do? He looked at her, then at the medallion in his hand. We send it back, he said, his voice steady. She nodded, no hesitation. Keanu stood, gripping the medallion tightly. He stepped forward, facing the towering darkness. It reached for him, tendrils stretching, but this time, he didn't flinch. He raised the medallion high. A pulse of golden light exploded from its surface, cutting through the night like a blade. The creatures shrieked and fell back, their bodies unraveling into mist. Umbra recoiled, its form distorting, thrashing. Keanu felt the power inside him now, not just the medallion, but himself. The legacy of his ancestors, the force that had been buried within him all along. He spoke the words. He didn't know how he knew them, but they came, ancient and powerful. The ground shook, the medallion blazed, its energy spiraling outward. The darkness screamed. Umbra writhed, resisting, fighting. But the pull was too strong. The pit yawned open once more, the black tendrils snapping, breaking apart as it was dragged back into the abyss. With a final, ear-splitting wail, Umbra collapsed inward, sucked back into the pit it had crawled from. Then, silence. The night was still. Keanu swayed on his feet, the medallion now a dull piece of metal in his palm. It was over. The villagers stood in stunned silence, the weight of centuries of fear lifting from their shoulders. Anya exhaled shakily. You did it. Keanu managed a tired smile. We did. Illy stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. You are one of us now, he said. Keanu looked around, at the faces filled with awe, with gratitude. He had come here searching for answers. Instead, he had found his purpose, and though the shadows had been pushed back, he knew this was only the beginning.